Thank you.
Thanks, Jess. It's always hard to come in after that. So feel free to take your time. And if you want to put your camera back on in order to ask questions, that's fine. Or if you prefer to put something in the chat, it's also fine. I'd be really interested to know what people took away from that film, what that sort of brought up for you.
Emma, we've got a couple of questions about whether people will be able to have the link from the video. That won't be the case, but did you want to just come in on that and explain the sort of the reasons behind that while we wait for people to take a moment and think if they've got any observations or questions?
Yeah, sure. So on that, we're not sharing the film because that's not our what we've agreed with young people who participated. But we are showing the film at meetings like this. And we would be happy to attend a team meeting or a strategy day or whatever, a workshop that you might have going on in your team or service. So please get in touch with me. I'll put my email in the chat. If you'd like to follow that up, we're really keen to ensure that the key messages that young people are telling us here reach as many professionals as possible.
Thanks, Emma. And, likewise, if anybody wants to get in touch with me or Jess via this group, and we can forward things on to Emma as well, but she's going to share her email address. Fiona.
Hiya, I think mine's it's kind of a question. It's an observation, I suppose. I've only had experience of working with one girl who had dolls, and she came just as you described, out of area. She was in the care system. She was in a unregistered, a non-Ofsted registered children's home. She wasn't in education, so her education was provided online. She had no relationship with the staff that were looking after her. And she was with us. She came through the out of court system, as in our youth panel system. So she was only with us for a very short time as well. So for me, I can just remember feeling really shocked, I think, thinking this is worse than being in prison. It feels like hell. And really feeling like I didn't know what to do with that. But equally, she then moved on. So there was always a plan that she would move on quite quickly. But it felt like she was sort of stuck and she was in limbo. She didn't know when she would be moving. And it kind of put our service in a situation where we weren't sort of in a position to really make ourselves a part of that girl's life either. It was a really strange position to be in. What would your advice be in those circumstances? Like, how should we work? Like, should we voice our concern? Because it feels like it's kind of almost beyond our there's nothing we can do to change that. I don't know. What would you advise? Like,
Thanks, Fiona. Can I just ask can you just say briefly what your service is?
Yeah, so I work for the Leeds Youth Justice Service.
Okay.
I've not come across it in area, as in they've been made in area. And I was sort of messaging my manager, and she said that her experience has also been from out of area.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
Yeah. So what you describe is probably very common, that children are in these circumstances are frequently moved around because to find them a placement that essentially will take them. So we know that providers refuse to take children who they deem to have very high risks and vulnerabilities that they're either not equipped to deal with, or they don't want to, or they put the cost up. And so local authorities are often between a rock and a hard place, and they have to find somewhere for children to be. So these are frequently children who are moved around, which of course makes things worse, because not only are they then moved away from important relationships and networks and their communities that they know, but they're also put into new communities and new service regimes. So your service was really not able to do anything in that small amount of time, and that would be very common. And we also hear that, for example, access to education falls away because eligibility to plans and so on all has to start again. We hear that CAMS won't work with children because they're not in stable placements. we hear that education providers won't do anything extra because the child's going to move again. So your service is not probably in a unique position. I think in terms of what you can do, probably, you know, just to communicate that you've noticed that this is happening, you know, that actually here is a young person who might otherwise benefit from your service, but who can't because of the decisions that have been taken about their care. And I think that's probably all that you can do. But it is very helpful for us to join the dots, because what we are increasingly understanding is that there is overlap with youth justice services, but they're not, the dots are not being joined, essentially. Essentially, some of these children will go down the youth justice route because that's what's deemed to be appropriate or needed on one day, and the next day, actually, it's a different route. And we know from the research that some, once the children go down a particular legal route, they are more likely to carry on down that route. So if you've been picked up via youth justice, for example, for want of a better word, then you're more likely to be involved in youth justice services. If you become perhaps you know, have gone under the Mental Health Act and to hospital because of an incident, then you're more likely to see those services. So this disconnect between services is actually one of the reasons why we're really failing children, and why we're ending up in a situation where really no one is taking responsibility for their care.
And I think that's how it felt, and it also didn't sit within the, because we did go back and challenge the unregulated placement, because she seemed to have been in that placement for longer than I guess, like, by law she should have been in that placement, but there was nowhere else to move her. So it was like, she's not going to be here long, she doesn't know the area, she's got no connections to any other young people or any freedom, but at the same time she's not going to be here, so there's no point. It's not a sustainable relationship for the Youth Justice Service to try to build with her either. So yeah, really, it's really interesting and really frightening. Thank you,
Fiona. I mean, thank you for sharing the examples. I think the more that you, as practitioners, that you do share these examples, it actually really helps for us to make the connections and to then identify what solutions might be. So thanks for that helpful contribution. A couple of other people. Shall I invite people in? Jennifer, have we got time? Yeah. Kelly, did you want to ask a question or comment?
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, nice to meet you. I think we were the service, I'm from Leicestershire, who asked for this to be put on this agenda last time, because we have had young people, all female. So that's one of my questions around the demographic, which I don't think we covered. But then also exactly what the other person was saying from Leeds. But we have young people that we're getting who have court orders or out of court disposals, who very quickly are then put on a doles and then moved out of area. So we're experiencing exactly the same thing. So they might have been from Leicestershire, gone to Cumbria or somewhere, and they're open here to CAMS. They're obviously open normally as a looked after child here, and they're open to other services, including us. They lose all of that bar their social worker when they move out of area, and then very quickly they're moved on to another area, and then they might come back to us at some point, but by that point they'll have been through 2 different CAM services, they'll have been picked up for possibly other offences, normally assault emergency workers, and it's just really difficult to manage in terms of our youth justice timeframes, in terms of completing, fulfilling, and kind of real condensed assessments, because as soon as you think you're on top of something or you're able to put some support in place, there's another move or there's another incident, which means that you're having to kind of rethink over and over again. And then of course you can't build relationships at all, and obviously everything is based on relationships and meaningful understanding of that young person. So I suppose I echo what the other person was saying, that it is increasingly difficult for us to manage children that are coming through with doles because of everything that you've said. So it's been really brilliant to hear that you're saying is exactly what we're experiencing, but then also that thing of our voices as practitioners who are really child first and child led, and us not actually having a voice to make any changes because they don't feel like there's any other options, when we would be absolutely advocating for everything that you've said in a court arena, in our youth justice court arena, because we know that it doesn't feel like the right thing to do. And then the other thing is, for us as the youth justice services, is that actually all of the girls that are coming through to us are, their offences are related to missing episodes and mental health crisis, and then assaulting emergency workers. And we have girls that have 30, 40 offences that are all assault emergency workers when they're in crisis as a looked after child. So there's an additional layer of like this punitive response to their own crises. So yeah, there's a lot there, but demographic is the thing that I'm asking for.
Yeah, thanks Kelly. I'm learning a lot from all of your experiences, so thanks very much for sharing that with me. I just to say, yes, I'm so sorry, I should have included the slide on gender. Yes, in terms of gender, it is actually roughly 50-50. So but we know that the differences in terms of needs, that you're more likely, this won't come to a surprise, I don't think, to you, that you're more likely to have boys in the criminal exploitation behaviour sort of domain, if you like, and girls in the mental health, self-harm, and sexual exploitation sort of domain. But those are, you know, rough, and I would, but however, one of the things that is concerning is that, because potentially of the way that, you know, the way we understand needs and behaviours is gendered, there are potential risks in the way that these new routes or solutions to this problem develop along gendered lines. And so there is more work to be done with yourselves and others to kind of really unpick some of that, to really understand a bit more what the sort of what the different experiences are of girls and boys, and you've explained some of that to me just now. But in terms of the overall numbers, the data we have, it is about 50-50. So, but I expect that would vary by area too. So we don't have that data, but right down in the local areas. I just wanted to say, in terms of that those cases that you mentioned, do you know why they were on Dole's orders? Was it because for their own safety, or was it because of contextual harms, or not?
It was for their own safety.
Yeah.
It was everything that it was a huge melting pot of all missing episodes, exploitation, mental health, suicidal ideation, standing on top of buildings threatening to jump off, whilst also assaulting emergency workers, but not, all of it.
And would youth justice services be involved in the placing authority? So if they're moving, you know,
so
they would be.
Yeah, we would say as they'd be caretaking it basically.
Okay.
But say the particular girl that I'm thinking of, she ended up coming back to Leicester, but after moving 3 times prior to that. So the doles lasted for a short period of time, and she moved to Cumbria. But then, of course, as a looked after child, she's moving from there. So it's the moving around that is the biggest headache for us.
Yeah.
So she came back to us in the end, but she, you know, whilst we're trying to successfully complete the order that she's on, and build relationships and put support in place, but then the next youth justice service is caretaking that case, and they are having to do the same thing, and then the next youth justice service is having to do it, and it's just not achievable in terms of us being able to do meaningful work.
Yeah, of course, absolutely. And although, you know, I've watched the development of Child First with great interest, but it does feel that these you know, what's going on for these children means that however hard you're trying in your individual services, it's very, very, very difficult to for those principles to really be applied across these different systems and places. Yeah, thanks very much, Kelly. Were there any other questions or reflections if we've got time?
I was just going to pick up on one that was in the chat, Emma. You spoke about sort of your work with other government organisations and other sort of working bodies. And someone's asked around the training or information that's given to care staff. I don't know if you have any sort of involvement in that or any sort of update on any support that can be given there.
Yeah, so I mean, there isn't anything at the moment. I mean, one of my biggest concerns at the moment is that the legislative reform that's on the table is going to take about 3 years to come to be enacted. So, you know, that's 1,200 children coming through on these orders. And so, no, there isn't at the moment. But what we are trying to do is to educate wide range of different professional groups who might have interaction both through the family courts, but then more widely in different systems, but particularly providers of care. And there is, I think, a sort of a short-term set proposals which are, or shorter term, which is to say that we need to recognise that there are huge deficits in the care system in terms of the quality of the care. There's a range of quality in the provision in children's residential care, but there is some very poor care where you're seeing professionals who are not at all trained, and then there is some care that is very, very good, but there isn't enough of that very, very good. But the incentives at the moment for those providers to actually invest in their workforce are very low. And that is in part because we've got ourselves into a difficult position. As somebody described it to me recently, it's like a tanker that has gone into a harbour and now needs to reverse, and it can't. And we've spent you know, more than a decade getting this tanker into the harbour, and it is because there are so many children in care. We do not have a system that's able to respond, and what you're seeing and to care for them, and what you're seeing at this end of the spectrum, if you like, is the symptom of system failure. So in the long term, we need a complete transformation of our care workforce. But in the short term, we need to recognise that carers who are looking after these children need to be supported to do so. And at the moment, we're not doing that at all. So more to be done, Emily, on that. So ideas welcome. Yeah, it's prompted a couple more questions. Selena.
Hi, yeah, mine was
Hello.
kind of a question after the video. A lot of the young people spoke about they don't know how they're going to feel after, how it's going to affect them later. I was wondering, what is the transition from the dolls, or is there a plan in place? How does that look for young people?
Thanks, Selena. I feel very passionately about this area around transitions. So I'm afraid to say that there isn't good long-term planning. We know that these decisions are made in a crisis. Often, you know, I mean, you know, the example that Kelly gave, you can well see how that can get to another crisis point, and then, you know, we just need this somewhere for this child to go, and then they go, and it's not going to meet their needs, and they're not going to get the care they need, and so on and so on. But really, the focus for everybody involved is understandably about just keeping that child safe in the short term. So we're just really thinking, we don't want this child to die, and we don't want this child to come to harm. And because that's how we, you know, collectively systems get to that point, we're not able, there's not much capacity in space and say, well, what's this for? How are we going to make sure that this is a positive decision for this child? What is it we need? And we know that, you know, in the existing secure estate, we're very good at focusing on reducing risk, but we're much less good at thinking about what's going to happen next. And so transitions and step downs out of these placements are barely thought about at the moment, to the point where that's why we're seeing children in these deprivation of liberty orders for so very long, because it's very hard to move them on. providers won't take them. There aren't any more available places for them to go in the community. Nobody's working effectively with their families, and they might be very far from home, as Kelly has said. So those services that might be very well equipped, like some of yours, to actually do that work, are not able to do that work. So we're really stuck, I'm afraid, around transitions, both in terms of transitions from these placements, but also transitions in terms of age. And I'm very concerned about the fact that for many of these children, some of those children that appeared in that data 2-3 years ago, they right now are living in independent circumstances or supported accommodation, or indeed are homeless. But we don't have that outcomes information.
Okay, thank you.
Just going to bring Dale in, and then that is the last one before we move on. If that's all right, thank you.
Yeah, of course, Dale.
Just really interesting to see and hear the impact, because I've only recently come over to Youth Justice. For the last 3 years, I was a team manager of a placement service, trying to find placements for children. And just, what we're describing, it's a national crisis. There isn't the provision in-house, so we haven't used external providers. There's not that buy-in, because they know, I hate to say it, sometimes it is that we're going to get paid anyway, whichever child it is. So something just happens. 28 days notice. Again, 28 days notice. There's no sort of buy-in around how can we support this young person, keep them here. This is a bit too difficult. Let's put in the 28 days notice. And like you say, that the move around from area to area, you can't do any meaningful work. The social workers themselves are just as frustrated as everybody else. It can be literally, like you say, that Friday afternoon of they've just got to go somewhere. Matching just goes out the window. It's literally just, we need a roof and somebody who'll accept this young person. And it's just a terrible situation, because it can often make things worse for that young person when they're going into poorly matched homes, where, like you say, staff aren't able to meet need. That creates more problems, untrained staff. So again, the assaults against staff, because perhaps things are mishandled when a young person is in crisis. But it's a really, really big, it's a national crisis, that the placement situation, both in foster care and residential settings. And it does have, like we say, those knock-on effects to all of the other services, because we're talking about most of our work with young people is that relational. You have to build that relationship with young people to do meaningful work. And how do you do that when they're moving, every couple of months, because they're in crisis? So, it is interesting seeing sort of the other side and the wider impact it has with other services trying to work with young people.
Yeah. Thanks very much, Dale. And I think one of the things you're reflecting on there is just how very, very difficult it is for all professionals involved. There is an awful lot of people working really, really hard for children, and yet the way our systems are structured, actually our services are structured along separate different lines with different legal routes and different methods and ways of working, and yet it feels at times almost impossible to do any better. And that's why we really, in moving forwards, what we're trying to do enough of Family Justice Observatory is focus on what are the systemic things that need to be addressed. That it's not just, we could put new models of care out there, we could put more money out there, but actually if we don't address some of the systemic reasons, the drivers around how services are not able to work together, our relationship with risk and our anxiety around harm, and how we equip our workforce to manage that, there's some real really knotty, difficult things that need to be worked through, but it is possible. And so I think, what's happened in the Youth Justice Service, over the last period of time is really testament to it is possible to change cultures. And so, we'll be really like to stay in touch with all of you to see how we can learn and move forward together.
Fantastic. Thank you, Emma. I was just going to say, on that note, I'm sure we could continue, and I'm sure there are a lot more questions and comments that come out of that. So if you're happy to, Emma, we can sort of share email addresses, and obviously please invite people to get directly in contact, or obviously with myself and Jenny, and we can pass anything on. But thank you so much, Emma. Your contributions and insights have been really, really interesting. On that note, I'm just going to reshare the agenda. hopefully everyone can see there. And we're going to explore further into the experience of a girl who was subjected to a dolls. From Neath Port Talbot, we've got Hannah Bevan and Amy Singh, who are going to share this girl's experience from their Youth Justice Service. So over to you, Hannah and Amy.
Morning, everyone. I'm just going to wait for Hannah to share the presentation and I'll introduce myself while she's doing that. So my name's Amy Singh and I'm a senior practitioner in Neath Port Talbot Youth Justice Service. Hannah is one of our social workers in the team and she is currently working with this young person who we'll be about to talk about just in a bit more detail. So the purpose of our presentation is that we want to provide you really with a case study of this young person that we are working with, who has fairly recently been released from custody and has been subject to a dolls for, I want to say, like almost 3 months now. So we just want to give a pen picture really of how she came involved in our service and with social services, and where we're at now really, and just our experiences of working with a young person who is subject to a dolls, but also subject to really strict license conditions as well. And also we want to capture her voice in all this and how she feels, because like in Emma's video, she's found it very, very difficult, adhering to this, and she's feeling that like she can't do anything either, like a lot of young people in that video. So if I make a start, so we're going to refer to the young person as M. Sorry, Hannah's just starting now. Okay, so M is 16 years old and is a female. And what we already know from research is that it's a high percentage of children who are subject to adults are aged between 14 and 16. So M has been known to our services on and off throughout her whole life, experiencing periods of being in care. She's been on the child protection register 3 times in her life for neglect and physical abuse. And her last period of registration, there was concerns of sexual exploitation. And from the research, what we found is that children who are subject to adults are highly vulnerable and have significant experiences of adversity and trauma. And a high percentage of children were already well known to services before the adults application was made.
Before going into Secure Children's Home, Emma had already experienced 7 different placements in a 10-month period. And these were unregulated placements, from Airbnbs to being in a caravan, to then going back home with family, family not being able to manage that. So she was put back into voluntary care with a local authority until she finally went into a residential placement. And unfortunately, this broke down within a 3-month period. And then sadly, she was then remanded into custody for a serious violent offence. Again, with research and what Emma was saying previously, is that the research shows us that in the months and years prior to a doll's application, there have been significant periods of instability. She pleaded guilty while she was on remand and given a 2 years and 8-month sentence, with 50% of this being served in custody. So she carried on staying in the Secure Children's Home from where she was remanded. And then when coming to the end of her custodial sentence, her risk factors were still being deemed high by the local authority, who then applied for a secure welfare order, which was granted by the court. And therefore, she'd already had just over a year of being on remand, and then the custodial sentence, and then she stayed in the Secure Children's Home on a secure welfare order.
Okay, so from what we've obviously heard as well with Emma, so bucks the trend that girls are usually placed on dolls for self-harm, mental health and or CSE concerns. And whereas boys are normally usually placed on dolls due to the consideration risk posed to other and criminal exploitation, it's only since being subject to a doll's order that concerns around self-harm and her emotional well-being have been raised. And what we've seen during this period of subject to a doll's is that we have seen an increase in her mental health, haven't we, Han, and self-harming and missing episodes as well. So we're seeing that the risk is increasing even though she's subject to a doll's. And we're still seeing that, you know, whilst welfare orders both highlight the concerns around behaviours in the community, with the main factors being the severe and immediate risk of harm to others and themselves, we feel we've questioned this point whether the dolls is actually working for this young person, because we're actually seeing an increase in her mental health and in turn her offending behaviour, which we will talk about further on.
And in terms of what previously around placements, we are experiencing exactly the same thing. So when she was subject to a secure welfare order for another 8 months beyond the custodial sentence, we had the same reaction from Children's Services in terms that they are struggling around finding a placement because of her complex needs, concerns from placements in regard to her index offence, which involved a knife, and then trying to do things in-house was very, very difficult. No foster carers were coming forward. And then placements that were coming forward for her were just not suitable in terms of the therapeutic needs. And this is, you know, again, something that the research is highlighting with 45.6% of dolls placements are unregistered. This is exactly what's happened to our young person. They are now in an unregistered placement. And we've seen it across not just our own local authority, but when we were having discussions around licence conditions this time last year, you know, the Youth Custody Service were also echoing what we were experiencing, which is the difficulty in finding a placement, and that being a national picture as well. And some of the things that came out of that was the research were that risks were being seen along gendered lines, especially when it came to violent offending with girls, which is what we have with M. Is a serious violence offence, and therefore, you know, lots of placements were just saying that they couldn't manage or didn't feel like they could manage any type of violent offending or violent behaviour or aggressive behaviour, given the fact that, you know, there was also lots of therapeutic work happening around her at the same time. That just wasn't something that we were able to kind of break through.
So as Hannah mentioned, the placement is a solo and registered placement. So it's basically the local authority have sourced a housing provider, and they have employed private agency staff who are supporting in this placement. So the local authority and the Guardian in court felt that the dolls order was seen to support the placement and the transition plan from a secure setting into the community. So she's now subject to a dolls, which she has been for almost 3 months now, Han, isn't it? And
Yeah.
you know, I'm not sure when that is up for review, but at the moment, her dolls order restricts her access to sharp implements, mainly knives. I mean, it was to the point where she had to ask staff for a spoon to eat a yogurt because she was not allowed to access any cutlery at all. Obviously, she was required to ask staff to use a knife if she wanted to cook, and it was logged by staff. She has daytime supervision with 2-to-1 staff members. Doors and windows are locked. The use of physical restraints can be utilised if she poses any immediate risk to herself and others. And I can recall shortly after the dolls was in place, we actually went and visited the young person, and it was due to her being reported missing because she could not cope with these conditions. She'd spent a significant amount of time in custody and subject to the secure welfare order, where her deprivation of liberty has been, deprived over those years, and now she's been released into the community, where the YJS promote resettlement into the community, and reintegrating, and she felt that she couldn't do that because she was supervised 24/7 by staff. She couldn't see her friends without staff being there, and that was a really big thing for her, not seeing her friends for a number of years. And then she's got to have people around her seeing her friends. So we actually spoke to this young person at this meeting, didn't we, Han? And we said, like, it's too much. I don't, why can't I just be let out for like a few hours a day? And Hannah actually went back to social services and the Guardian, because it was the Guardian who actually proposed the dolls at court. It wasn't the local authority. And we said, look, is there any way that we can just allow her 2 to 3 hours in the community? And thankfully that was agreed, and the young person is responding to that quite well, isn't she, Han? So it was just that like little 2 and 3 hours a day just to have that time unsupervised. And obviously there's a plan in place where she contacts staff and staff contact her just to check she's okay. But the young person is so extremely grateful for that time. And it's just really sad, really, that, that's the situation she's in.
She's dealing with 2 very restrictive orders and compliance that's happening at the same time. So, this time last year, we were having to submit the licence conditions, and we were under MAPA as a result of that, in terms of putting those together. So in terms of, like, she's got the basic license conditions, but also additional license conditions, and the additional license conditions are mainly around victim safety, so an exclusion zone, a non-contact list, and I guess restrictions around then in terms of her relationship, so notifying myself and the Youth Justice Service if she enters a new relationship, as that was one of the triggers of the index offence. And when we were looking, and hearing about that Children's Services were going to be looking at dolls, we pulled out this, which is a piece of Youth Justice Board guidance, which is not to twin license conditions with ISS, intensive supervision surveillance orders, because there's been previous research that shows that the 2 interventions are not compatible and usually do not have the desired outcome for the young person. And we pulled this out because we, in essence, felt that the dolls was a kind of different version of an ISS interventions, with even more restrictive measures such as restraint and locked doors and windows being implemented. And whilst we are invited to now the weekly reviews, we were not included in the first kind of discussions around what the dolls order should look like. It was just, we're going to do this. We're informing you we're doing this. The Guardian is the one that wants us to put this in place. And there was just a kind of sense that the local authority felt they didn't have much choice, that to get her off the secure welfare order, the dolls was a means of a way of doing that, to get her back out into the community, so that they could say to providers of placements, she's going to be under a dolls, and therefore, we're going to step her down and have this transition where she'll be having, the replication of some of the things that she's experienced in a secure children's home, like staff supervision, lock doors, and that would be a way then of like reintegrating her and reintroducing her into the community. But like Amy said, we went back immediately and said that we need a scaling back of the measures, such as, you know, giving her free time in the community, especially to go and see friends, to feel like a normal teenager, to, you know, go shopping without 2 members of staff kind of trailing behind you and looking at what you're buying. Why are you buying that for? What is this for? How are you going to pay for it? You know, it's all those kind of questions that come with some of the basics then of freedoms that I think we all take for granted. But we have come up with again some significant barriers again, which have, you know, been highlighted by that video and by what Emma was saying previously. And that main barrier is education.
Yeah. So we're having a really difficult time with education providers at the moment with them. Obviously, it's to do with her offence and in unlicensed conditions, as well as the dolls too. And what we've found in terms of in relation to dolls and education is that it has a detrimental impact on education, training, and socialisation. And you know, training providers are uncomfortable with the idea of 2 members of staff being present in a classroom alongside other young people on the course too. And also for Em as well, like, you know, I know she's going to be feeling very embarrassed if 2 members of staff were accompanying her to her education provider and other young people asking, well, who are these people with you? Why are they there? And so on. We are feeling like, because she's in a solo placement with no interaction with any other young people, she's very socially isolated for many hours of the day. And 2 to 1 staff, it makes it awkward for her to be around her friends, which I mentioned earlier, and be a normal teenager.
Mm-hmm. I think what I'd add to that as well, Amy, is that with the training providers, they haven't seen the dolls as a supportive thing. They've seen it as a risk factor, and they've kind of seen it as a way of gosh, this young person must be very dangerous, you know, very risky, and therefore, you know, they are required to be looked at by 2 members of staff all the time. How are we possibly going to manage that? And with Emma herself, she wants to do hairdressing, so, you know, the whole question of scissors has come up so many times in terms of, you know, will we have to lock scissors away? Can she have access to them? Will she, you know, suddenly, you know, go on a rampage and start stabbing people with, like, these are literally the conversations that I've been having with providers. And it's a really, for something that I think especially like the Guardian has viewed the dolls as a kind of protective factor. The reality of it, when we are trying to then implement it and to work alongside it as a youth justice service, the reality of it is that it's actually increased their risk factors, not decreased them.
Yeah. You know, we're finding a lot of education providers and not willing to obviously take her, and we're trying to think of like other options really, so that she can, you know, she wants to do hairdressing, and you know, first and foremost we have to consider the risk, isn't it? But we also want this young person to be engaged in education. She hasn't been, obviously she received education when she was in the secure setting, but we want her to be able to be in education because we see it as such a desistance factor. And you know, we're trying to think of other ways, aren't we, Han, in order to get her involved in education. So yeah, it's an ongoing battle.
And what does Em say with in all of this? It's not a positive picture, as you can see by the comments. You know, the first one is that it doesn't benefit me. Constantly being 2 to 1 with staff is shit. I don't have friends who live like this. Again, it's reflective of what was said in the video, and what Emma's research was saying is that she didn't feel listened to when the dolls order was first being discussed. My guardian told me that it was in my best interest, but since court is done, they've left me and I'm not seeing the dolls order through with me. So, you know, as a guardian solicitors, and what their role is that once court proceedings are over, the guardian that doesn't do any further work with young people. So I think she's felt a little bit abandoned, a little bit you've put this pressure on the local authority to do this, and now you're not here, you're not seeing me through this. License conditions are needed, but it's another restriction on my life. I find it difficult to manage both. And people wonder why I ran away. It's kind of like that pressure, the feelings of missing out as well, is such a strong factor in and what she says, which I haven't typed up, but what she says quite a lot is that the Dole's order is like teasing her. So it's giving her some sort of freedom, but then it takes it away. So that even with the 3 hours that she's got, she's like, right, and she's on 8 hours free time now, which we have agreed to. So it's a significant part of the day now that she actually gets to be out without the 2-to-1 support. But she's saying then that, but I still have to come back to these restrictions. I've still got a curfew that I've got to come back to. I've still got to come back to the locked doors, the locked windows. I've still got to come back to a placement where there's staff. And the nature of it is that whilst we have really tried to get the message of consistency, that there needs to be the same staff members around all the time, to build relationships, to get that consistency, to get that stability, inevitably staff turnover happens, and it has happened in our case, and it happened quite quickly, where a member of staff that she was getting along with really, really well put in their notice, and therefore they left the agency. So even though we've been really trying as a youth justice service with support of the enhanced case management, so that's having the forensic mental health services involved with them as well, and mainly with professionals, that's the message. It's just not happened. So I think at the moment she only feels like she's got 3 members of staff that she really has a relationship with, which then causes difficulties then with 2 members of staff, or if anybody's on sick or annual leave, there's all those difficulties with it as well. And there's lots of requirements then that is on her in terms of, as part of her licence conditions, she does need to engage with the Youth Justice Service on a weekly basis. And then she's got lots of appointments for being a care experienced young person. So she's got an IRO, she's got, those review meetings, which are happening a little bit more regularly, during this transition period. So there's a lot more appointments. And I think the point about, gender that she raised, I didn't even prompt her on this, is that I feel people see me as being more vulnerable than a boy. I don't think a boy would have experienced this. And that was a really interesting comment from her in terms of thinking about her gender, thinking about why this was happening to her. And the only positive comment that she gave me was, I do have a lot of staff around me that I can take advantage of in terms of opportunities. So that is something that she did recognise, but most often than not, it's just, her word is, it's shit. It's shit, it's not worth it. I don't understand why I need it. And that it seems to be reflective of everything that has come, before us in these presentations. And then, for us, in terms of our reflections of youth justice, she's been deprived of her liberty now and freedom for nearly 2 years, when you take into account the time on remand, the custodial sentence, the secure welfare order, and now the community dolls order. Literally, has experienced every type of restriction on her liberty that can happen to a young person through our systems. And then I think sometimes when we have the ideas of like, why is she self-harming? You know, why is she, you know, feeling depressed and down? You know, this sentence just really captures that in terms of her experiences is so out of the norm for most young people, and for her to go through every single type of deprivation of liberty is really difficult for her.
Yeah. Obviously, as a YJS service, we always work in a trauma-informed way, and we want to understand and how this feels and looks like for her, which is why we always want to capture her voice in all of this. And Hannah is excellent in terms of like feeding back to social services, challenging social services on certain decisions as well. She's excellent. And, you know, she's a real advocate for Em in terms of getting her views across. And yeah, that's really, really important for us. It's been so challenging in terms of like navigating all the requirements from competing agencies in terms of like the Guardian, social services, you know, education and so on. It's been really, really difficult. And yeah, I mean, we do feel, you know, we've had a lot of discussions as a team around this, and we do feel the dolls has been made out of fear in reaction to risk levels instead of thinking what is right for this young person when she's being released from custody. You know, there was talks of like placements out of county, wasn't there, Han? Maybe more therapeutic placements that would have been suitable for Em, but you know, I can leave that for you guys to kind of reflect on and observe about why those placements weren't selected. But yeah, we've just found it really, really difficult working with somebody who's subject to strict license conditions as well as adults too. So yeah, that's the end of the presentation, and we're willing to take any like reflections, observations, questions on the matter, whether it's in the chat or if you want to raise your hand.
Thank you so much to both of you. And I think just so interesting to see how much that reflects everything that Emma said and all of those experiences of the children in the video. And then we're hearing the same thing again, and the complexity of navigating that. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for the advocacy that you have done on behalf of Em, because it really, really brought home to me how much that you know, those workers, those relationships that you've obviously built with this young person have really actually made a huge difference to her. So thank you from that perspective as well. We are going to actually move on to our next presenter, because in my first experience of chairing, I have very badly managed the time, and we could absolutely walk up. You know, we could talk about this all day, couldn't we? Absolutely. So we're actually going to move on to Claire's presentation, but please do feel free to put questions into the chat. We will hopefully have some time at the very end for questions and reflections more broadly and generally, or if you've got anything for Hannah and Amy. And, you know, very much like with Emma, we'd like to keep some of these conversations going and this work and this reflections, because this is a huge topic and it's a really, really important one, isn't it? And something that very clearly is very relevant to youth justice, and I think we're really beginning to unpick how relevant, and also very relevant to girls. And I think that was such an important point, wasn't it, that Em herself had made, to sort of recognise and reflect on how she'd been treated specifically as a girl in this situation, and the perception of risk and the perception of sort of girls as being difficult, which is something we have reflected on in previous sessions. So we're going to move on to Claire now. And Claire is going to be talking about supporting care experience girls, which again feeds in so much to this. So have we got you here, Claire?
Yes, you have. Can you hear me okay, Jenny?
Yes, absolutely, Claire, we can. Thank you.
Brilliant, thanks. I'm just going to try and share my slides, so hopefully this will work. Okay,
Yeah,
are they showing up there?
We can see
Brilliant.
them. Thanks, Claire.
Thank you. Well, thanks very much for the invitation to come today. Great to be here. Great to see so much interesting girls with the numbers of people on the call. And yeah, thanks to the previous speakers for such powerful presentations. It's difficult to follow that, but really, really important, this work on dolls that's going on. Okay, so I really want to share some findings from a study that I had the pleasure to lead from Lancaster with some fantastic colleagues, Katie Hunter, Julie Shaw, Jo Staines from the Universities of Bristol, Liverpool, John Moores, and now Manchester Met University, on disrupting the routes between care and custody for girls and women. So this was a project that was funded by the Nuffield Foundation, and really I want to sort of just draw out some of the messages that came out of that work. What we did for the research, really what we were interested in is exploring sort of the relatively neglected needs at that point, certainly in research, of girls who are care experienced and who move on to the criminal justice system. And as many of you will know, there's a persistent overrepresentation of care experienced girls in the youth justice system. As a care experienced researcher myself, I always feel it's important to say there's absolutely nothing inevitable about that. And yet we found very strongly themes coming through in our work about still, even with all the great work going on around prevention and diversion, that there were problems of excessive surveillance for girls in the care system, where challenging behaviour was still more likely to come to official attention by virtue of these girls being in the care of the state. At the same time as there being potentially excessive surveillance, there was also inadequate support that came through as a really strong theme when girls had experienced prior victimisation or abuse, or perhaps exploitation that was so easily minimised or ignored. What we did for the work, I should say, just briefly, we did quite a few elements to it. We did an international literature review, we did some analysis of local policy protocols, and we did 94 interviews. And that included speaking to care experienced women in prison across 3 prisons in England, girls and young women in the community involved with youth justice, and various professional groups, including those from children's services, youth justice, prisons, probation, and the judiciary. And we're really grateful to everyone who took part in the work. I think the emotional nature of this kind of topic came through really strongly in the interviews. We expected that from some of our interviews with those with lived experience. It came through really strongly with the professionals we spoke to as well. And we heard from many passionate practitioners and many going above and beyond, and it's great to hear about the advocacy that goes on. I think this work is so important, and actually the things that you all do as practitioners, even small things, can and do make a difference, and so advocacy is so very important, I think. Okay, so just by way of context, and I'm sure some of this will be familiar, but I just wanted to sort of situate the topic in the wider policy context at the moment. We've had the independent review of girls in custody by Susanna Hancock earlier in the year, and it was great to see the links being made with care experience there too, and the importance of focusing on care experienced girls. As you've just heard, linking care experience and dolls, of course, that's something that's coming through really strongly in the work, and girls more likely to be deprived of liberty due to self-harm, mental health, exploitation. There's the others who are far more expert on those issues than me on the call that you've already heard from. We've got the national protocol too on preventing unnecessary criminalisation in care, and local protocols that either emerged after that or some were in existence prior to it, that are really important in trying to address some of these issues. And there's lots of work ongoing, I believe, at the moment to update the protocols nationally and locally in some instances. And part of that involves moving beyond one size fits all. Recognise the importance of gendered harms, for example, how risk may play out in different ways for girls, again, which links back to some of the things that we've already heard. Also thinking about racialised harms, thinking about neurodiversity, disability, how injustice plays out at the intersections. And I think hopefully some of that will come through in some of the developmental work that's going on at the moment. There's also work by HMPPS. Again, you may be familiar with the Guide on Care Experience Matters that came out in 2023. Just one example of work that's been ongoing. But I think there was a real kind of genuine attempt to get lived experience perspectives coming through in that guide. And that's been an important piece of work. And I suppose a question is, and this has already been alluded to in previous talks, can we make connections between all the works that's going on, often in different areas of policy or practice? Do we join up the dots? Child first, for example, something that so many folks on this call will be working on, so important. Questions still to be asked about, is every child seen as first as a child? So issues around adultification of certain minoritized groups really raise questions around that. Representation of those in care do too. And perhaps there's questions too about, if we're really to make a child first youth justice system count, do we also need a child first society as well? Like a child first education system that doesn't punish and exclude, like a child first care system, which might sound ridiculous because of course a care system should be child first, but actually some of the things we've just heard about on this meeting suggest that it clearly isn't all of the time. And that's not to take away from practitioners who are passionate, who work so hard, but it is to highlight some of the issues in our systems and structures that can make change really difficult. I think if we want sustainable long-term change in some of these areas, though, we do need to make the connections, and we do need to try and join up the dots, and perhaps that's a message for those sort of writing policies as well, and in some of our government departments. Yeah, I won't dwell on this slide too much, because I feel probably everybody on the call will be quite familiar with the problem of unnecessary criminalisation, particularly intense for girls and women. Some work by ONS recently that reflected back on previous data showed actually rates of immediate custodial sentences, which we know are small in number now, 25 times higher for girls who'd spent time in care. And data linkage work is showing that actually some of the trends have been a lot worse than some of the figures previously suggested. So criminalisation in care, it's a theme that certainly came through in the care experience women in prison we spoke to, the girls and young women in the community, despite clearly ongoing efforts and a lot of work going into diversion and prevention. As Ellie put it, there's still this stigma within the care system. You're in care, every minor accident you have is clearly intentional, was her perception. You're a piece of shit, let's get you arrested. Jenny talked about that difference between responding to challenging behaviour that might take place in a care setting as opposed to in a birth family. So she talked about smashing a telly, getting arrested for it, having a criminal record, stating that, you know, she has a criminal damage record. Yes, I broke that telly, I'm fully aware of that. At the same time, if I was at home with my parents and I smashed a telly, be like, oh, tough luck, you've smashed your telly, now you can't watch it. So really sort of highlighting potentially these very different responses to challenging behaviour that can be responded to vastly differently depending on the care setting. So something that came through really strongly in the work was that negative gendered judgments could interact with the care status. They could overlap with racialized judgments for some girls and class judgments to perpetuate stigma. And that was evident in different ways, but with care experienced girls and women variously being described as more difficult to engage, disrespectful, dismissive, aggressive. Quote there from one of our judges: looked after girls tend to be disengaged, have their own protective shell, difficult to get through to. In my experience, girls in the youth court are worse than boys. Girls much harder to engage, far more dismissive, have a tendency either as a defence mechanism or because it's how they feel to be disrespectful. Really interesting to think about how some of these negative gendered judgments might play out, even by those who are at the same time trying to ensure that girls are not abandoned in court and get the support that they need. But negative judgments of girls fit with wider perceptions that we know from research that girls and women can be perceived as more difficult to work with. There's that wider discrimination of girls generally in society, and arguably care experience can add that additional layer of disadvantage. But also on top of that, a reliance on official files can also reinforce negative judgments. And this was something that came through really quite strongly from some of the girls and women we spoke to. So easy is it? And again, I think this has been highlighted powerfully already, but to end up with a really thick file of incidents on your care file, if you're living in a particular setting. Things are recorded about you because there's a requirement to record, of course, but things are written about you that just simply would not necessarily make it onto a piece of paper if you weren't necessarily in care. Ellie, as she put it, this is the quote on the slide, my support worker at the care home, one of the things she said that really peed me off was like, I've read your file, I know everything about you. I was like, no, you've read my file. You know what's on my file. And then just really poignantly, I think I'm more than just a piece of paper. There's more stuff that has happened to me before the point of my file. So looking beyond the official file was something that came through strongly. A note of good practice was pointed out by one young woman who said her care worker, actually it might have been a social worker, sat down with her and said, you look like an absolutely horrible person on paper, but I don't care. I want to sit down with you now and I want you to tell me who you are. And she said just how refreshing that was and how new that was and how much she appreciated the chance for someone to realise that she wasn't just her paper self as has been described by some. Interactions with the police, again, could be difficult for those who were already known by the police, having a care status as perhaps a prior victim or child in care or an alleged offender. Interesting comments also being made, though, about responses to being arrested or being restrained. And some described panicking when restrained, which can be an entirely rational response, particularly for girls who may have experienced abuse, violence or physical coercion, as a number of the women in our study had. And Hannah described getting sweaty and anxious, and they're like, can you stop swearing at us? They're like, right, if you carry on speaking to us like that, we're going to arrest you. Again, it's thinking about how people respond, why they might respond in a particular way, particularly if they've experienced a lot of trauma, and what the result and consequences of arresting someone and giving them a criminal record that can stay, even if not always revealed, but for many years. Troubling tensions were also highlighted as a key theme, and especially around communication and trust. I think that's already come through from the previous talks too. Frustrations often around judges, for example, not feeling that girls were able to talk in the courtroom. They'll say they don't want to talk, they don't want to be involved, they feel they're not being listened to. But also we sort of heard messages, well, they've got a lawyer to speak for them. But there were real tensions around having a voice potentially and also feeling unheard. And other participants absolutely recognised some of the nuances around this and why it was so important to understand the nuances. If you've been impacted significantly by your experiences in care, one said, maybe subject to exploitation, you might think you're worthless, you've had a rubbish life, maybe you've spent your life not saying that, maybe you don't say that even to your own lawyer, you don't think you'll be heard. I think there's real issues that, you know, many girls in care may have experienced prior victimisation, abuse, exploitation, and been coerced into silence. Silence can be a survival strategy. For some, it may be a long-term survival strategy, and it can be tough to overcome. And it stands in direct contrast to this idea of giving voice, making sure someone's got a voice, but it can provide really key context for what may appear as a lack of engagement in court or a lack of engagement with other practitioners and professionals. So in terms of recommendations for practice, challenging negative gender judgments, moving beyond hard to reach, difficult to engage, recognising that risk, as was said by the previous speakers, risk can play out in different ways for girls. Maybe there are fears around risk that means we respond in particular ways, thinking of what the consequences of that might be. Recognising silence may be a long established survival strategy, looking beyond the official file, which may serve as a site of stigma in itself. promoting awareness of the national protocol on reducing unnecessary criminalisation. And I think the fact that the government even used those words, unnecessary criminalisation, now means that, you know, there is official recognition that this is a thing, this is a problem for certain groups. Listening without judgment. Girls wanted to be listened to by non-judgmental professionals, and they wanted to be believed, and raising aspirations, thinking about future possibilities, future outcomes. There's lots of good practice on this, but one great example is Lawyers Who Care, who are a lived experience-led organisation. Some of you might have heard of them, who are actively trying to bring more care experience people into the legal profession and get that much more diversity. And joining up the dots between connecting policy and practice priorities, as I mentioned at the beginning, I think it is so very important. And I suppose, you know, when we don't, it's seeing the long-term vision as well. And although, you know, many of you will be doing such important work just dealing with the here and now, but actually it's thinking about what likely outcomes might be in the future. And if we don't support care experienced girls in conflict with the law now, these are potentially the women in prison of the future who can so easily be abandoned. Equally, the small things that you do, as said, can and do make a real difference. And you may not always see the impact of those things that you're doing now with girls on their future lives, but they can make a huge difference. And when practitioners are advocating for girls, believing girls, going above and beyond, I think this is felt for a long time. I feel like I've absolutely flown through that, but hopefully it still allows some time for questions. If you're interested in any of the resources from the Disrupting the Roots Between Care and Custody project, or a slightly more articulate version of some of the things that I've just been trying to say, please do check out some of the articles on that link. There's a number of free to view articles, or please get in touch if you'd like to know more after today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Claire. And that was very articulate. There was no issues whatsoever, but I appreciate you rattling through it so we can potentially have some more comments and questions. So we do have a hand up, but I'm not sure if it's a deliberate hand up. Let me just see here. That is Lucy. Did you want to come in if you got a question or a comment? I suspect, Lucy Newnham, it might be an accidental hand up. So have we got any other questions, comments? We've got 10 minutes left to cram them in, but we can get through a few certainly. Everyone's gone quiet now.
I appreciate everyone's been bombarded probably with a lot of information at this point. But yeah, I mean, get in touch after today as well. If there aren't questions, more than happy to carry the conversation on sort of beyond this call.
Thank you. Thanks. Oh, we've got Simon now. Simon, do you want to come in?
Yeah, hi, yeah, just what you. I know it's a common theme for everyone, but one of the things was about when girls, in particular, that are missing and they get sort of accosted by police officers who react in a potentially unhelpful way. We had a discussion the other day about it. One of the things that I did as a reparation worker was the girl's reparation was to write a letter from her perspective to the police on how she would like to be dealt with, which we share sometimes with some of our colleagues in the best approach and what she was going through at the time. And I found it really helpful to get into the mindset of this young lady. Obviously, being male myself and not having the same experience was really helpful. And yeah, so interesting in how so many young people are criminalised for acting in a way that at the moment in time seems perfectly rational. It's how is it still happening?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, great to hear about an example, a good practice where, you're actually talking to the girls, you're trying to find out from their perspectives what would work. I think that's really important. But yeah, the question of why it's still happening is a good one. I think these things need repeating. They are persistent issues, and I think some of it is, or a lot of it is, about problems with systems and structures, because there are many people working really hard to try and make sure that these things don't happen. Possibly the joining up the dots, making sure that everyone's talking to each other, making sure the training's in place for everyone as folks come in new to services or move on to different areas is really important. resources is something that's been spoken about today, of course, already. You know, there's some really big, massive structural issues here. But I think, you know, you look at the numbers of those in youth justice and the dramatic falls that we've seen, it shows that change is possible. It shows that things can be achieved. And, you know, there's more room to go in terms of care experience girls, I would argue strongly, but there's clearly ability to make change. And I think it requires being persistent, as well as the work of a lot of passionate people as well.
Hi, Emma.
Hi, and thanks so much, Claire, for your presentation. I was just wondering about that joining the dots, both in terms of research, but also at policy level. What do you think would be helpful? Because I can see that there is a relationship between the numbers of people on deprivation and liberty orders and the criminalisation of girls and the overlaps, but it isn't actually part of the national discussion as much as it should be at the moment in relation to deprivation and liberty orders. So I was just wondering about your reflections on that and whether there's any thinking about joining the dots in that regard.
Do you mean about dolls specifically, or just sort of more generally joining the dots?
I mean both either.
Yeah, I think it's really challenging, especially as people in important sort of policy positions, I guess a bit like government ministers, move on very quickly, and then it's almost like new people come in and are learning an area quite quickly. I think one thing for me is seeing the sort of intergenerational links. So of course it's really important to focus on girls. It's seeing what girls may become and linking up with women, the girls and Justice Board, the Women's Justice Board. I don't know whether they're necessarily meant to be talking to each other, but I think it would be great if they did. Again, for women in prison, what's happening to their children? What are the responses? How many are being taken into the care system? There's so many overlapping issues, actually, if we think about it from an intergenerational approach, but then if we think about it from a cross-departmental approach as well. I mean, on the dolls side, I feel, yeah, it's really hard. I was at the East London Family Justice Board conference yesterday and hearing some people speak about this need for a holistic vision, everyone working together, youth justice, children's services, the legal profession, the judiciary, everyone coming from the same page. And that can be really tricky when not everyone has the same priorities or are necessarily measured on the same things. But hearing the talks on dolls before, I mean, there's so many sort of shared themes here, actually, and the connections absolutely need to be made.
Thank you, both of you. I think we could actually talk all day about this and probably all week as well. And thank you so much to everybody for getting involved in the discussions. And I feel like this is sort of the start of conversations rather than the end point. Nice as well to hear some sort of messages of hope. And that's really important, isn't it? Is that we don't lose track of the fact that a difference can be made with individual girls as well, as we've very much seen today. I think that was an incredibly powerful thing to sort of reflect on, but also that kind of systemic change and what have you, to recognise that is possible, and that we can all play a part in that. So I'm certainly very keen in continuing these conversations. Unfortunately, we only have 4 minutes left of this forum to continue those conversations. So we are going to sort of draw to a close in a minute. Jess, I don't know if you wanted to come in with the questions about, we've kind of got a very quick, just to sort of think about what our next quarterly forum may want to focus on, but also, again, those conversations can continue after the close of today as well.
Yeah, absolutely, everyone. So we would just invite people in the last couple of minutes to share any ideas or thoughts that they had for the future forums. As Jenny said, this topic today, and we've heard from one of the services that sort of suggested this topic, we want to make sure that we are sort of focusing and inviting services and sort of guest speakers and sort of experienced professionals into each of these individual topics that we focus on within this Girls Practitioners Forum. So if anyone has any thoughts, please feel free to put them in the chat. If you see something that you think that's a good idea, feel free to give us a thumbs up. And Jenny and I can review the chat after the meeting. And as Jenny said as well, do feel free to pop us an email with any sort of further ideas and questions as well. Whilst people might be doing that, I'll also take the opportunity just to share that we've put together a draft terms of reference for the group, just to sort of provide a framework for any sort of objectives of the group, how we sort of structure the group going forward, who we invite, who comes along. So as I said, we've put the draft together. We will send them out with the presentations, and Claire, if it's okay with you, we will absolutely include your report that you co-authored on the disrupting the care, routes between care and custody. We will include all of those through, and please do feel free to have a look at them, and any changes or anything you may want to make, please do, again, just get in touch with Jenny or I, and we will be more than happy to sort of factor those into the terms of reference. Thank you.
Yeah, just a shout out as well, because I'm not sure if she was here at the very beginning, to our wonderful Tracy Green, who started the forum. And Emma's just popped in the chat there that when Tracy started this forum, there were around 20 participants. So we've had in today's session, I think we had about 78 at its highest point. I know everybody's going to dash off to their next meetings now. And yeah, we are over 100 on this in terms of the participants and the mailing list that we have. And, you know, please do continue to invite colleagues and share this group widely. This is in terms of topics as well. This is your group. This is a group that belongs to you as practitioners. And we very much just want to facilitate those opportunities for discussion. I did see the discussion about the in-person conference and very much liked that idea. So perhaps more discussion on that. But really, really great to have your participation, and you know, the fact that this group is growing and growing just really does demonstrate how much there is a need for these conversations. So thank you, and thank you for all of your contributions, and thank you most of all to our amazing speakers. Really, really powerful today, and we really, really have enjoyed that. I certainly have, and lots of food for thought. So some ideas popping into the chat now around other ideas. Please do feel free to continue to share those with us. We will send out relatively soon the date of the next forum, and share with you some of those sort of thoughts and suggestions from colleagues around England and Wales. So thank you very much. Tracy's also mentioned as well, violence against women and girls. We actually had a mention there from Lydia. Thank you. The next regional developing practice forum that the YJB run within your region, the next topic actually is violence against women and girls. So there will be an opportunity to talk about that at your regional level with your YJB developing practice forum as well. So please do make sure you're involved in that if you're not already. So thank you very much to everybody, and we will see you at the next one. Bye bye.